I look at public relations as kind of a standard textbook definition as um, the strategic management function within an organization that's really concerned with mutual benefit between both an organization's and the publics with whom it's involved. So that could be activists, employees. It's really meaningful to an organization, and we could probably have as many post-its as are on that wall and the picture there for the types of publics that an organization could theoretically serve and be involved with. So public relations, when we think about it, it often happens in a corporate or an agency type setting, but I want to propose that it also happens in science settings as well. And a lot of us on this call are all obviously familiar with the field of science communication and the idea of scientists and science working to engage publics with science and scientific concepts. And sometimes that can be to inspire audiences, that can be to increase science literacy. It can be a lot of different things, citizen science projects. And really my research looks at the intersection of these two disciplines. And increasingly, that's, I guess the older I get, the more ingrained I get of like, wow, this is really fascinating and this is what I'm really excited about. So increasingly, I continue to look at this intersection. And now, so when I started my PhD back in 2012, the field looked a lot different, at least a little different than it does now. There were still science communication journals, obviously, and there was really meaningful work that was happening, but there wasn't as much in what we would dub strategic science communication or public relations. There might be individual studies. There were individual researchers and research teams who were pursuing work that might not be identified explicitly as science public relations, but certainly studies that formed the basis of what we would conceive of as science public relations and strategic science communication were starting. And so based on the state of the discipline, a lot of my early work and continuing work has really focused on two different types of streams. One is, how do organizations who deal with science and environmental risk, how do they communicate with publics? And so a lot of this work has been done, virtually all of this work has been done in collaboration with others. I like to collaborate with people, and I think it produces a better product than if I were just to do something by myself. And so one of my collaborators, Nicole Lee, who's at Arizona State, and I and some other collaborators too have done a lot of this work. We've looked at how government science agencies in the U.S. Work to engage the public with science and environmental risk. More recently, we've done a lot of work with looking at corporate science communication and how, in the context of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, for example, those types of companies balance the need for an innovative, risky product. How do you balance scientific literacy that's necessary and communicating about more what we would think of as fundamental science communication, and also balancing traditional product promotion at the same time, which has been fascinating. And again, if there's any of this type of work that you want to talk about during the Q&A, I'm happy to do that. But taking a step forward, so we've really been taking stock of the organizations and the professionals who might be identified as communication professionals or might not be identified as communication professionals, but who does the communication work in those organizations and what does that look like? And then taking it a step further, what strategies do these professionals and organizations use for engagement? And depending on what they use, we might sometimes just look to theory if it's not theoretically informed, and comparing both in theory and practice, what we say as researchers, this is how it should be done versus what's done. What are the outcomes? What are the effects on different audiences? And here's an example of a data visualization study that we did looking at climatedata.us. And so this data visualization was produced by Habitat 7 in collaboration with NASA Ames, and we got to come in collaboration with them to test the effectiveness of this data visualization, for example. But again, this is all not necessarily science public relations work. So I wanted to give you an example of a recent study that a collaborator and I did that might look more fundamentally like science public relations. And so my collaborator, Dr. Laura Lemon, who's also at the University of Alabama, and I completed this. Data collection was actually during the pandemic, so we were just grateful that people wanted to hop on Zoom. I guess there wasn't Zoom fatigue at that point, probably, but wanted to hop on Zoom and do some interviews with us. So we were really interested in thinking about how universities use communication to facilitate interdisciplinary research. And again, this publication is in the Journal of Communication Management. So if you're interested, there's the link and a shortened title, but you have the journal, and feel free to email me. I'm happy to send you any copies of work or talk further after this talk. And so what we were really interested in here is looking at public relations from an internal engagement perspective, which tends to not receive as much attention as thinking about organizations communicating with external publics, right? So my colleague, Dr. Lemon, really focuses on employee engagement, internal communication, that role in public relations. And so combining both of our interests, we were really fascinated by the idea that particularly in the US, there are a lot of universities who like to organize researchers around what they term grand challenges. You might have heard of wicked problems, for example. And so, for example, here at the University of Alabama, there are institutes dedicated to issues around water, issues around life research, issues around transportation, issues around cybersecurity. And all of these researchers around the university can self-select to participate. There are funding mechanisms, and the goal is to really organize and motivate, facilitate research around these grand challenges that face society. And so we were really interested in how the university's communication function, regardless of what level it is, and the professionals within the organization, if there are processes or norms that they follow, how does communication play this role in interdisciplinary research, if at all? And if so, does it do so effectively? The theoretical framework that we used, we adopted the central meso micro approach, and you'll see that kind of come through in when I talk about the sample and so forth. So based on the previous literature, the research questions that we were really interested in pursuing were, how do professionals at these different levels of the institution perceive interdisciplinarity in the research enterprise? And the second research question was, how do these communication structures and processes at universities either help or hinder interdisciplinary research? And so you can see with our method, we conducted 21 semi-structured in-depth interviews, and we got participants from 15 different U.S. research-intensive institutions. In terms of gender breakdown, 12 participants self-identified as male, 9 self-identified as female. And you can see we got a little bit of diversity in terms of professional role. And so the first stage that we took with sampling was a propulsive sampling approach. So we knew that based on this central meso micro, approach, that we wanted to pursue participants from different levels of the institution. So we reached out to vice presidents of research at different institutions, research and institute center directors at different institutions, and then tenure track and research faculty. And when we started doing these interviews, we found out very quickly that these weren't the only people that we needed to talk to. And obviously we should have done that beforehand too. So we also did a theoretical sampling approach where it was clear that we needed to also talk to the communication professionals who support research in these ways. So we also talked to 5 of those folks. You can see the interviews were conducted via Zoom. The average interview lasted about 39 minutes. And that last point there, you can see there was a lot of data to sift through, and it was fun going through all of that and coming up with seeing what our findings were. Our analytic approach, the first stage that we used was reviewing the accuracy of the transcripts to make sure that they were accurate. The first stage of coding was open coding. So we went through and basically assigned a word or phrase, a code to every word or phrase that was pertinent to the research questions that we had posed. From there, we kind of reduced down and collapsed codes to make sure that they were more focused and pertinent to the research questions that were posed. And this resulted in 2 emergent themes, and then in one of our themes, 3 sub-themes for research question 1, and then 3 themes emerged for research question 2, and I'll talk about those next. And so again, our first research question, we were really interested in how this whole process we're trying to promote interdisciplinarity, how's that perceived among different professionals within these organizations. The first theme that emerged was that collaboration is really a part of institutional culture. And so when we asked people to kind of talk to us about what does interdisciplinarity mean to you, or how do you define it? How do you describe it? Collaboration was the most frequent term used. And it really came up across the board. It was really, there was this sense of collaboration as the ethos of a university's research culture. And so you can see from this quote from a research center director, it's partly cultural. So this university is very interdisciplinary and collaborative. One of my more senior colleagues likes to say that this university's faculty hunt in packs. You have people that are here to, I think, connect in this way, and that makes it much easier. Sorry. And then the second theme that emerged, which really builds from this first theme, is that the value of interdisciplinarity is really established at the central level, kind of from top down. So there were sub-themes that emerged that really kind of give weight to this idea. And the first is that formal incentives were primarily used to initially communicate the value from the top level. And so multiple, and I'm sure a lot of us on this call have experiences with this. What you value, resources go to it, right? And so a lot of universities have seed mechanisms where they provide funding to organize multidisciplinary teams to make them more competitive for external funding, for example. And so we saw this kind of across the board, that formal incentives were used initially to communicate the value of interdisciplinary research. But we also saw, which was also very encouraging, that that value is upheld through intrinsic rewards. So people didn't just do it because of the money. The seed funding probably wasn't all that much anyway, right? But people really wanted to network. They wanted to learn more about how other people from across the university are approaching a similar problem in a different way. And they really wanted to learn from each other. And you can see how some of these quotes kind of uphold these findings. The third sub-theme builds from that and communicated that value really extends beyond the central level. So a lot of the people that we talked to, it wasn't enough just to have some seed funding. It wasn't enough just to network, but they really wanted their work to have impact. And a lot of the folks that we talked to saw collaborating on these multidisciplinary teams as a mechanism that their work could have more value beyond just another journal publication, for example. And you can see this quote as exemplifying that. So having people who can collaborate at the same problem or issue from different methodologies, you see so many micro changes that can make a difference. And again, that's I think we all would probably identify with that. We want our work to have impact, right? So that really kind of speaks to what themes emerged from research question 1. For research question 2, again, 3 main themes emerged related to how communication at these institutions supports interdisciplinarity. The first theme that emerged is that communication is essential. No one we talked to, and perhaps they knew we were communication researchers, so no one said, we don't care about communication. Everybody clearly thought that communication was important. And as witnessed by this quote from this vice president for research, research is really where you give people hope and get them excited about what's happening at the university. And again, this person was talking about people outside the university. But a lot of people also talked about, yes, it's important, but it's not always resourced or supported. And so Some folks, research professors in particular, talked about, this is, and you can see this second quote down here that talks about the burden, the second subtheme, which talks about the burden of decentralized communication. You don't really get points for being a good salesman for your research. And so even though communication is important, a lot of times people talked about it not being supported in the way that it should, or not having budget or even funding mechanisms that they applied to. They said, yeah, they want it, but they don't really give us money to do it. And so even though communication is central and essential, in instances where it was decentralized and not supported, it also seemed to be a bit of a burden. And as you can imagine, the third theme kind of relates to this, is that it seemed like the optimal communication for employees at the university was a blended approach where employees across the board feel empowered to own communication, to do it, and to feel like they can be responsible for it, but that there's also centralized support for people who have expertise in it, who have relationships and know where to place messaging, who to contact, how to do it the right way, and so forth. So again, this is a first study. There's a lot to unpack here, but based on these findings, one research question that definitely emerges is what communication strategies and structures are best suited for facilitating this, and is that contingent on certain types of teams, certain types of projects, certain scales? More research needs to be done to better answer those questions. But also, we did find that it's important to also play up intrinsic and extrinsic awards. So we don't want to only rely on people's passion for the work. If you want it to sustain, it looks like, at least from the results of our study, that it's going to take a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, and perhaps a nimble communication support system. But again, all of that needs to be fleshed out in the future. And just in general, in both public relations and probably science communication too, we need more work on internal, for example, employee engagement and science communication. And so again, that's one example of what I would consider a science public relations study. Now I kind of want to zoom out a bit and lean heavily on an article that I published with my awesome colleague at Arizona State, Nicole Lee, where we talked about different observations that we've seen in both public relations and science communication literatures, and perhaps areas for future research. And again, these are three themes that we identified. Again, they're not mutually exclusive. They're not even exhaustive. It's just three areas of research that we saw that an agenda in science public relations could really maybe move the field forward. And if these two literatures speak to each other in these areas, it would probably be, to quote public relations, mutually beneficial, right? So if we think about the trend toward engagement and participation, we can kind of think about how both fields of public relations and science communication have evolved. And so in terms of public relations, I think what most scholars would probably hold up as the most effective or ethical model of public relations is what they would refer to as dialogic communication and two-way symmetrical communication. And this is an instance where the communication hierarchy is flat, and there's a co-creational approach to communication with the organization and its publics. It's not that a two-way symmetrical approach is always the most feasible, but if we're trying to strive for ethical communication, what we would consider theoretical best practice, then we would want to try to work toward two-way symmetrical communication. Along similar lines, the science communication discipline has moved beyond, in most cases, thinking about publics from a deficit model perspective, right? And even moved on from thinking about dialogic approaches that aren't necessarily genuine to move into this more democratic participatory engagement type of way of engaging. So in those senses, the public relations literature and the science communication literature have kind of evolved in parallel, and in the same way. However, I think there are opportunities to better define engagement. So, and this is not a lot of this is not new. I'm just summarizing what a lot of other very intelligent people have talked about over the years and trying to highlight and elevate that conversation. But in terms of engagement and participation, there seems to be a need to better define engagement. And I think, to quote, I don't want to misattribute, but I think it was Maureen Taylor and maybe Kim Johnston, who in one of their book chapters on communication engagement talked about, if engagement means everything to everyone, then it means nothing. I'm butchering that quote, but you get the idea. If engagement can mean a lot to a lot of different people, and depending on the context, so we really need to refine our understanding of engagement. What outcomes are important for what context? How do you engage with particular types of publics? For example, some of the research I've done would suggest that there are opportunities to engage audiences on social media, but a lot of times those audiences can be hostile. So how do we engage, or is it productive to engage with hostile audiences, audiences who are hostile to science, for example? Are there mechanisms or ways that it would be productive? And if so, what would that look like? How do we better engage underserved audiences in these contexts? How can science organizations better engage and be resourced to engage underserved audiences? How do we better communicate science visually? These are all examples of how a more refined, defined agenda on science public relations could perhaps move this engagement and participation area forward. And again, there might be some instances that I'm not even talking about, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and look forward to discussing a lot of this more in the Q&A if you're interested in it. The second area that we identified was also looking at practitioner roles and training. So in public relations, there's been a huge push for a long time to talk about public relations as a profession. And so in a lot of ways, a lot of people would debate, is this a profession or not? It's not a profession in the same way that, if I tell you, oh, I'm sick, you wouldn't say, person off the street, oh, are you a doctor? Can you check me out? You want to make sure that doctor has a medical license, a degree, has taken all the tests. Make sure you've taken all the tests if you're going to examine me if I'm sick, right? Do we have that same approach when we approach a public relations practitioner? Probably not, right? So people can say they do PR, practice public relations, and they don't have to have a license to do that. And perhaps that's fine. But there have been moves to create training programs beyond curricula and universities and so forth. But you can become accredited, for example, in public relations that demonstrates your commitment to professional development and continuing education and so forth. Again, not that it's necessary, but there's just been a big push for professional associations, obviously, to have codes of ethics. And the whole idea is, it's no secret that public relations has its own PR problem, right? A lot of times practitioners are viewed as dishonest, as unethical, perhaps. And so how do we correct that? We try to put safeguards in place, curriculum, training, professional codes of conduct, codes of ethics that can guide professional decision-making and professional behavior, right? I would be curious if there are science communication professionals who consider themselves science public relations practitioners. And if so, if that literature would also help bridge a professional development gap if one exists. So for example, a lot of communication practitioners, science communication practitioners tend to be scientists who also do science communication or scientist turned science communicator. And they have a rich expertise in science, and they take it upon themselves to learn a lot about the tactics of science, and some even learn social science and so forth. And a lot of people do a lot of really good work. But in a lot of cases, science communication practitioners and professionals aren't trained in communication, for example, strategy. They're not trained in social science evaluation, for example. And they might not think about those things. So that's an area where I think public relations or communication more broadly and science communication can really help each other in a, again, another mutually beneficial way to advance both the theory and practice in terms of roles and training. But you're never going to get away from scientists not doing communication. For example, here in the US, if Congress is going to talk to somebody about science, it's probably going to be a science policy expert, but it's definitely going to be a scientist who has the technical expertise. And in a lot of ways, communication professionals can help prepare scientists for those types of roles, media relations and media training, for example. But kind of figuring out in what context practitioners should or could support or manage in those roles, and defining that more clearly would probably be a productive way forward. And then finally, and this is where I'll end, and I purposely did this because I could talk about this for days. This is when I think of public relations, I think of issues management, and I'll explain what I mean by that. It wasn't until my senior year, my final year of undergraduate studies, that in public relations, that I really understood public relations as a strategic management function. So I had heard the textbook definition, the definition that I basically gave you at the beginning of this talk, which was, it's the function concerned with mutually beneficial relationships between organizations and publics. Oh, okay, that makes sense, I think. But I always thought of it as media relations, or, we're the people who do press releases, or we create graphics. We do that type of stuff. We manage social media. And at that point, social media wasn't as big of a deal, but we might manage social media when I was a student. It's definitely a big part of the job now, right? It seems in a lot of my classes, it seemed to be more of a reactive function. So you put out fires when management does bad things or something like that. And it wasn't until I took a course in issues management that I started to see public relations as a proactive management function, as a true management function that, yes, it's concerned with the tactical pieces, the press release, the content calendar, those types of things, but that all of those pieces fit into this larger framework, this strategic framework that you need to evaluate, and the importance of monitoring those things over time. And so if we think about issues management, it's really the process of monitoring, identifying, prioritizing, and acting on, and hopefully in some cases leading issues that can affect an organization. And then for the rest of this conversation, I want to think about science organizations. We could even think about the academic enterprise, science itself as a big organization, even down to an individual team or a science lab, for example. But I'll talk about the research enterprise and science as organization. And so issues management is where I would see could be an organizing framework for the rest of what we've talked about, or what I've talked about today. And so if we can talk more about that during the Q&A, but this is where a lot of my research is headed in the next few years, and I'll be curious your thoughts or questions related to this. And so the reason why I would say issues management in public relations is such an important piece to add to science communication, or an agenda for science public relations, for example, is that as much as we want to get away from it being perhaps a political endeavor, you can't remove the political from the science, right? So here's a quote from Schweifele back in 2014. He says that science can tell citizens how vaccines work, what their likely side effects are, and what the risks are for individuals and society. The vaccination issue, however, also raises a series of ethical and political questions. Should vaccines be mandated? If yes, should there be exceptions based on religious concerns? What kinds of trade-offs should societies allow between a person's individual choice to not get vaccinated and the increased risks for all members of society if fewer people get vaccinated? And how can we harmonize regulatory frameworks across different political systems with different underlying value systems to minimize the likelihood of global epidemics? We can now update that to say global pandemics. So this was in 2014, before COVID-19, and this quote probably is just as salient today as it was, if not more salient today than it was 10 years ago. And do we still have answers to these questions? Probably not. We saw how a lot of it played out across the globe. But one thing is clear is that we need a way to study this in society, and theory and practice need to get up to speed so that we can have more productive solutions or resolutions when issues like this emerge. Similarly, a few years later, Bruce Levenstein from Cornell University wrote in a chapter talking about scientific controversies that perhaps the problem is that scientific controversies are too diverse and too historically contingent to provide management guidance. The science of science communication can only be descriptive and analytical. But perhaps the problem is that we have not studied scientific and technological controversies enough to find the enduring patterns. Perhaps we're just at the beginning of study of controversy, and there's much to do. Spoiler alert, I very much identify with the latter half of this quote, and I see issues management as the organizing framework to help us understand, at least from an organizational perspective, from the perspective of science and science organizations, how to study controversies and the role of organizations in scientific controversy, and what role can or should they play. And so just to back up a little bit, the way that we would think of an issue is it's just a contestable matter of fact, value, or policy. So you can take multiple different issues and there are contestations around the facts, the values that we hold around those scientific issues, or the policy solutions that are put into place. And in a lot of situations, all three of those things relate to the specific science issue. So they're very messy, but the idea is with any issue, there are at least two sides that are contesting to some degree about the issues. Those issues can be internal or external to the organization. So again, if we think of science as an organization, an internal issue might be open science. So, and actually there's a study that colleague Dr. Brian Britt and I have under review right now that I think we presented it at the last PCST meeting, but basically looking at how discourse around the issue of open science evolved in the scientific community on social media over time. And so there are now mechanisms to try to understand and observe the evolution of issues and different actors in the process. Whereas, for example, with computational methods, and some of those methods we weren't able to use before. But that's an example of an internal issue. An external issue, a classic example would be climate change. And externally, even though the scientific community largely agrees that climate change is happening, that it's largely human influenced and anthropogenic, there are still deniers and people on the outside that say, but there's uncertainty. When will it happen? How? Which we can all, I'm sure we all have our opinions about that. But again, because there are people who would cast doubt and not value that, or potential policy positions related to that, that becomes an issue that then science has to, or scientists have to address and grapple with. But again, if science communication can look to the discipline of issues management, perhaps that's a way to start to move forward how we do this, or pose some questions related to this vein, and start to move this forward more programmatically. So some sample questions we could ask: can and should science or science organizations communicate about instances of contentious science beyond simply disseminating scientific findings? Again, can we move beyond a deficit model to engage in these discussions? If so, what would that look like? When, how, and why do we want those with expertise and we left expertise broad, lay expertise, technical expertise, expertise across domains. When do we want that to support decision-making, and when and why do we want people with expertise to advocate for specific options or positions? This quote was taken from the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Science Communication Report published in 2017. It said, choices about what scientific evidence to communicate when, how, and to whom can be a reflection of the communicator's values. This fact becomes especially salient when the science pertains to an individual decision or policy choice that is contentious. One important ethical question is how far science communicators should go beyond simply communicating scientific facts and theories in an effort to influence decisions. Individual science communicators have differing perspectives on their roles as advocates, and this issue will continue to be debated. Even though this issue will continue to be debated, and it's still debated today, one point that I would raise is that if people who are science communicators identify as science public relations professionals, they could look to public relations codes of conduct, ethical codes of conduct, for guidance in terms of professional decision-making and behavior. And for example, if you look at the Public Relations Society of America's Code of Ethics and the member statement of professional values, the number one professional, or the top professional value, and again, I think they're valued equally. It just happens to be that, luckily for this presentation, it's organized at the top. Advocacy is the first professional value listed. And what the advocacy value says is that we serve the public interest by acting as responsible advocates for those we represent. We provide a voice in the marketplace of ideas, facts, and viewpoints to aid informed public debate. So the question that I would pose is, should a science public relations practitioner advocate and use the best available science? And again, I know that's a loaded term, to serve as a voice in the marketplace of ideas, perhaps. And so again, some questions that could be pursued in this line of research. Again, how can advocacy, issues management, and more broadly public relations be practiced ethically and effectively in science? What organizations and practitioners can and should provide counsel? And what is the role of communication in the management of such organizations? Again, it could be formal or informal. There's a lot to unpack, and there's just a lot that's not perhaps explicit in the literature yet. And then finally, does the scientific community have the operational capacity to engage in strategic issues management? If so, who does that? And that is, does science have the infrastructure to systematically identify, monitor, and manage or lead issues that emerge? And even if we do have the capacity as a scientific community, should we? So some of those questions are empirical, some of those questions are not empirical. If you have a high need for closure like me, I'm sorry, I'm ending with questions. And so I hope some of this at least sparked your interest, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Again, if we're not able to talk today, feel free to reach out to me. I would love to continue the conversation here or in the future. Thank you.